J Philosopher here, and I'm going to be commenting on Dewinthemorning's video, Karl Marx, Freethinker and Humanist, Part 6. I think, yes, Marx would have used the internet and blogging as a tool, just as he used the printing press and newspapers as a tool to get his ideas circulated in his time period. I think it's important to remember that Marx, even 5 years before he started writing for a newspaper and writing his articles, and even before he did his thesis, he had written a book of poetry. So Marx starts out as a romantic poet. The romantic poets of the period are people who carried the ideals of the French Revolution, fraternity, equality, and liberté in their hearts and in their poetry, and they basically kept the flame alive of the French Revolution that had basically tried to put the ideals of the French philosophers of the 18th century, of the Enlightenment, into practice. They were crushed, of course, politically, and the French Revolution was defeated. However, the poets kept the ideals in their hearts, and so it's important to see that Marx is part of that romantic poetry movement. Also, Hegel, he becomes an absolute idealist, rather than seeing the ideal, seeing the material world suppress the ideals of the French Revolution. He goes into a radical direction, and his dialectics is completely negates the world in a certain sense and makes the world totally ideal. So that kind of radicalism, I think, also has to be taken into account. Okay, his attacks on censorship, I was surprised at how specific they were. He kind of takes apart the censorship laws of his period of time and shows basically that they aren't laws for the people, they are laws for specifically one group of people in order to suppress democracy. And it's these laws that he fights against and denounces. The article about gathering up timber and gathering brushwood that the peasants were no longer allowed to gather, although that had been their traditional right, I think that's kind of interesting. His defense of the peasants and his defense of poor people's customary rights. He notes that the privileged classes, it's through private property that the privileged classes take away the customary rights of the poor. Rights were not well defined in the Middle Ages, and so different people had different rights. And in this case, the peasants had the right to gather firewood from lands that were not being used, of course, although they were owned by landlords. So here's the government stepping in and basically taking the side of the landlords and no longer allowing the customary rights that had been allowed in medieval times to the poor, which shows how kind of vicious the ruling class was at that period of time, even taking away rights that had been practiced for hundreds of years, if not 1,000 years before. He writes at the end of that, when the privileged classes appeal from legal right to their customary rights, they are demanding, instead of the human content of right, its animal form, which has now lost its reality and become an animal mask. When the privileged classes put forward rights, and mainly they put forward property rights, this is our property and you can't have it, these are really animal rights. Human beings live in a society, and all human beings are equal in that society, and so when privileged classes demand private property rights, they are actually taking away human rights from people. And that, I think, is an important point that Marx, at the very beginning of his career as a writer, has straight in his head, and unfortunately few people today have that as straight in their heads. Please continue with your discussion of Marx. It's fascinating, and I'll talk to you soon.